My freshman year of college, a girl in my dorm room used the word chick in conversation. She used it as an adjective to describe a piece of clothing or an ensemble or something that she thought was fashionable or appealing. And it took me a moment to realize that she meant chic. And so I turned to her and I said this word chic to her with a sort of an evil twinkle in my eye, and she immediately blushed and realized her mistake. Now I mention this because I was a fucking asshole, such a shitty thing to do, but I think it's only sort of recently I think I've come to understand that it was wrong of me for three reasons. First and most obviously, you shouldn't correct people's pronunciation. You shouldn't, make a point of being a dick to people when you see they got something wrong. So that's obvious. The second, I think, so Rachel, and by the way, Rachel, if you happen ever to hear this, I'm sorry. I was a jerk, and I knew it moments after having done it. But at any rate, Rachel and I, along with another classmate, went to Paris later that year for a sort of a study abroad thing. And if I had said to you just now, Rachel and I went to Paris, or even worse, had attempted a French R, you would rightly say, what a stuck-up, pretentious motherfucker. Because, when we're speaking English, we pronounce French words the English way. And, when they're speaking French, they pronounce English words the French way, and that's fine. And it doesn't matter. And you might as well say chick, because that's how English pronunciation would have you say it. So, I was twice wrong. But I think, more interestingly to me, I was wrong for a third reason. Which is that when people mispronounce words, we take it, it's embarrassing. We take it immediately as a sign of cluelessness or ignorance or even foolishness. And it is ignorance of a very particular kind. But really, what does it mean when someone uses a word in conversation and mispronounces it? Well, what it actually means is that person knows the word, but doesn't know how to say it. And so knows the word only from having read it, which really just tells you that person reads much more widely than any of her peers. Because in conversation, nobody else knows how the fuck to say that because nobody says it. So she's only ever encountered it on the page, which actually means that she's actually pretty smart. So mispronunciation, and I can't stress this enough, mispronunciation is a sign of intelligence. I actually think it is the opposite. The opposite of mispronunciation is misuse. That is, if you use a word that you have heard and thus pronounce it correctly, but you use it wrongly, in the wrong spot, then that is, if anything, a sign of ignorance. And yet, we have this sort of, the trend ends up going almost the other way around, where, if somebody says parabola instead of parabola, or annihilation instead of annihilation, or desultory instead of desultory, which I said until maybe fucking 2 years ago, we take that as a sign of ignorance. But if someone says reticent, where he should say hesitant, or bemuse, where he should say amuse, or nonplussed, where he should say nonchalant, though that battle was probably lost quite a while ago, we take this as a kind of a mark of sophistication. Well, reticent, that sounds like a sort of a more chic way of saying hesitant. When of course it's actually just a different word altogether. So, in conclusion, I know this has gone on for a little bit, but I want to land on this point. And if there's a motto for this podcast, if Slee Ricketts has a motto, And if we ever make t-shirts, I pledge that this will go on one of them. The motto is this: pronunciation doesn't matter. I stand by that. And on that note, let's start the fucking show. Recently, my daughter, my older daughter, has been really into Grimm's fairy tales. We mentioned this to the young woman who's been coming a couple days a week to watch our younger daughter, and she raised an eyebrow. She's a little surprised that Josie, who's 7, was into Grimm's fairy tales. Josie was specific in naming that. She didn't say, I'm reading fairy tales. She said, I'm reading Grimm's fairy tales. And the woman, said, I've never really read those, but I've heard about them. And of course, I'd heard about them too. And before spending a lot of time with them in my daughter's company, I had a particular idea about them. I was really raised on Disney fairy tales, and from a fairly young age was informed by wry, knowing grown-ups, often those without kids or those with older kids, that the Disney fairy tales, those weren't the real fairy tales. If you want the originals, were a lot darker, a lot grislier. Sometimes more like horror stories than fairy tales. So I'd heard this for years and years, and so I was a little surprised when I read them with Josie. Not because we got some Baudelarized, blood-free version. There were certainly a few stories that were pretty gruesome. The robber bridegroom sees a young woman, hide behind a cask at her fiance's house, and secretly watch him drug, poison, butcher, and eat another young woman before she is supposed to meet him herself. That's a story that ends with the happy revelation at the end of that story is the tossing of a severed finger onto a dinner table. That one does have a happy ending. There are others that don't really have happy endings, or Sweetheart Roland, the heroine who's a little girl, has to trick the witch that she lives with into beheading her own daughter in her sleep. And that's just the beginning of the story. A lot of these stories end with the villain, that one does, either being trapped in sort of magic shoes or some kind of magic curse that force them to dance until they drop dead, like the girl in the Hans Christian Andersen story. Or sometimes the shoes are made of iron and they're burning hot, and so the villain is sort of grilled alive. There's a lot of public executions. There's a lot of sort of miserable death or exile. So there's plenty of blood and gore and violence, and just the good old ordinary versions of Red Riding Hood and Hansel and Gretel there's no nice way to tell those stories. But what surprised me was that the violence, the really grisly stories were relatively few and far between. There were plenty more that were just sort of goofy, relatively tame in, MPAA relevant content. Stories in which there were anthropomorphic coals, and there's the coal, the straw, and the bean, I think is one story. And it's just a sort of a dumb nonsense story. And the most violence that happens there is the bean, splits open. So there were a lot of them that were not really dark or grisly at all. And so the reputation of the book as a whole as being as an especially shadowy, horrific one felt inappropriate, but I think I also discovered what maybe made the Grimm's fairy tales disturbing and at least in another generation's eyes, not suitable for children. And it's not that they are violent. That there's some of it's there's some violence. It would be easy enough to skip the really bad violence in this book and still read the overwhelming majority of the book to your kid. What it would not be possible to do is to get around the absolute amorality of most of the stories. There are a handful of stories in which a younger brother is merely not rude to a magical dwarf in a forest, unlike his shithead older brothers, and as a result of that, is granted the water of life or something along these lines. But in most of these stories, misfortune, the man who, a little bit like Rip Van Winkle, plays nine pins with some curious knights in the mountains and then wakes up and I think 20 years have passed. There's the Catherine and Frederick and Catherine, I think is the story. And Catherine is the utterly foolhardy wife who, through sheer idiocy and a sort of a slapstick series of accidents, destroys her life with her husband and gives up all of their savings and then reclaims all of it again through just exactly the same idiocy that lost it in the first place. There's a story in which a very small boy learns how to grow up and be big, and then he becomes a big brute who beats everybody up, and through sheer violence and threat of violence, even though it's fairly cartoonish violence, he doesn't kill anyone. He just sort of batters his bosses and his enemies over the head until he gets everything he wants and he wins. There are stories that involve coercion. There are a lot of stories that just involve dumb luck. And the thing that is maybe really disturbing for children, or for some idea how children should be raised, is that these are not morality tales. They're not didactic. Or if they are didactic, then the lessons they teach are be lucky, don't let yourself be preyed upon by the predators who look exactly like your friends sometimes and other times look like monsters. And when in doubt, trick and take advantage of people in order to get ahead. And these are bad lessons indeed if you're growing up with some idea that your children should be raised with a Christian sense of selfless right and wrong. But they also strike me as pretty damn accurate. I mean, pretty true to life as one experiences it as an adult. And maybe that's really the thing. It's not so much that that we are afraid of exposing our kids to this. It's more that we part of the comfort of reading children's stories to children, I think, for a lot of people, is getting to pretend for a little while that the world is a fair place, and that if you just do the right thing, in the end, things are going to turn out well for you. You will save the princess, you will escape the witch, you will win the battle, and as one story memorably ends, you'll all live happily until you die. Let's start the fucking show. So one of the more odd cultural developments of the last, I guess 10 years or so has been what's now commonly referred to as ASMR. This is autonomous sensory meridian responses, is what it essentially stands for. That's, as far as I understand, a bunch of gobbledygook. It's just a sort of a placeholder initialism. ASMR is a genre of YouTube video, largely, in which practitioners, or as they call themselves, ASMR artists, and I'll come back to that term because I question it a little bit, they mostly whisper, tap, slide their fingernails on objects, and sort of perform soothing gestures toward the camera in an effort to elicit a peculiar tingly sensation in the scalp that some of us experienced growing up. I remember feeling this at library readings, listening to the crinkle of the mylar wrapping on the library books, and the soft tones of the librarian's voice as she read some children's story. So that experience is I think real. The micro industry of ASMR on YouTube is often mocked, and I think rightly mocked, easily mocked. It's also frequently compared to pornography, or as my brother-in-law put it, it is pornography. And he points to the prominence of beautiful young women among the most successful or most popular practitioners of ASMR. I think there's certainly truth to that. I think that there's some element of that, and it does seem like some of the people who do this also maybe dabble in various degrees of pornography that now exist, or shadings. But I think there's also another thing. I do enjoy these things sometimes, and my own favorite channel is one in which a middle-aged Danish man whispers about chess without ever appearing on screen, which, though it might be exciting sexually to some people, that's not quite my taste. I do find it comforting, though. I do find it soothing. So I think there is a sensation, scientifically verifiable or otherwise, that ASMR is setting out to induce. It got me thinking, though, this ASMR artist thing and this comparison to pornography, that neither of those feels quite right. ASMR isn't really porn, but it's also not really art. And that sent me back to the old question about what pornography is. Justice Potter Stewart famously, in deciding that Louis Malle's movie The Lovers was not hardcore pornography, he said of pornography famously, I know it when I see it. And that's a working definition a lot of people use. Looking this up in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the definition they offer is that pornography is any sexually explicit material, and that seems like a completely fucking useless definition. Well, I mean, and they as much as admit that by saying that in the Victorian era, images of a woman's bare calves might count as pornography. So this is basically meaningless. It isn't quite accurate today in that there are certainly images, movies, pieces of art that might feature the same degree of explicitness, but in one case count as art, in another as pornography. The super disturbing and really morally troubling movie Antichrist by Lars Von Trier comes to mind, which actually even features images of full sexual penetration, But boy, anyone who thinks that that's pornography has more problems than just a question of an overactive libido. So there does seem to be a kind of a need for, or at least a lack of, a kind of a clear definition. And so I started thinking about Aristotle, as one does. And in the Nicomachean Ethics, he presents this idea that, and like a lot of his ideas, it's sort of presented almost sideways on the way to a different point, that all human activity can be divided into three categories. And these three categories are praxis, poiesis, and theoria. And these, I'm neither a philosopher nor a classicist, so forgive me for my clumsy handling of the matter. But these terms, these Greek terms, praxis, poiesis, and theoria, are commonly translated as doing, making, and contemplating, something like this. Theoria, contemplating, thinking, thinking for the sake of thinking, maybe. So he says that these are sort of the three primary colors of human action. That there are certainly actions that include more than one of these, but these are kind of the three basic dimensions of human action. There's doing, there's making, and there's thinking or contemplating, meditating maybe, though not in the Buddhist sense. So applying this model to the ASMR porn art question, if poiesis, if art, if making, if the purpose there is the actual, the product, the object, right? You don't make a sculpture in order to prop up a table, right? You make it in order to be a sculpture. You don't sing a song in order to inform your troops that the enemy is approaching. You sing a song in order to sing a song. So the making is distinct from doing, and because doing is measured by its result, by its effect upon the world. So, what seemed clear to me for a moment, at least, was that art as poiesis is making. The purpose of art is art, whereas with ASMR and pornography, well, I think Oscar Wilde said, I don't know if he was the first, but he at least famously said, art is perfectly useless. So in that sense, ASMR that does not elicit any sort of comforting, tingly sensation, or even something in that ballpark that doesn't come close to that, is not really ASMR. Right? There may be some really beautiful ASMR videos. There may be ASMR videos that teach you something about chess. But if it doesn't elicit that feeling, then it's not really fair to call it ASMR. If it doesn't work toward that feeling, or elicit that feeling for somebody, or even theoretically elicit that feeling, if it's nowhere in the business of eliciting that feeling, well, then it's just not ASMR. And similarly, if pornography does not arouse anyone, it's clearly, there's no accounting for taste. But if it's not in the business of arousing any theoretical viewer or audience, then it's not really pornography. So in that sense, ASMR and porn are not art because they're too useful. Right? You can identify their use and their effectiveness, and in that sense, distinguish them from art because, as Wilde tells us, our art is useless. Now, as I said, this felt satisfying for a moment. And then I thought back to, if you heard my little spiel on Archibald MacLeish's Ars Poetica, this poem about the art of poetry, in which he says a poem should not mean but be, and I railed against this conclusion because it at least leads to the writing of a lot of poems that gaze into their own navels without concerning themselves with the experience of any reader. I have, in this podcast and elsewhere, expended a fair amount of energy on promoting the idea that poetry should have an effect on people. It should produce some effect. And similarly, comedy, good comedy, good stand-up comedy, say, as David Yezzi has already identified, is like poetry in that it produces an effect, or good poetry at least, it produces a somewhat reliable effect on the audience. And while ASMR and porn don't feel intuitively like art, really good stand-up comedy, I think, does. Really, the best of it. And this sent me back to another distinction, which is one when I was in college. I remember learning about we of course have the five senses, but then in the medieval ages, they had, the medieval age is a little redundant. In the Middle Ages, there was a notion of the five wits. This comes up in Shakespeare, it comes up in Everyman, some other literature at that time. I don't remember what all the five wits were. Let me see. It's common sense, fantasy, imagination, memory, and fuck if I know, something else. But a lot of them end up feeling a little bit redundant to us today. But the distinction I remember hearing from a professor between fantasy and imagination, and I don't know how medieval this really is. Maybe Marianne Corbett can clarify this for me, as well as reminding me what the fifth fucking wit was. But the distinction that I thought had some value to it, whether even if it wasn't scholarly value, was that imagination was a projection of a world that was like our own in enough of the fundamental qualities, and specifically in being unlike a fantasy. The key to a fantasy is that the fantasizer is at the center of it. That all elements of reality are warped and bent around the desires of the person fantasizing. I had Mark Strand, not long before he died. I had the pleasure of taking a class with him at Sewanee, and he made a curious distinction. He said, the difference between a surrealist and a fantasist, because he's been called a surrealist at times. The difference between a surrealist and a fantasist is that a surrealist presents bizarre, dreamlike images deliberately, knowing that they are bizarre and dreamlike in order to produce some sensation in the reader, or to argue some point or make some comparison. The surrealist deliberately presents these unreal chimeras. The fantasist presents what he believes is ordinary reality, but to the rest of the world, the product of the fantasist is nearly indistinguishable from that of the surrealist. And then he said this as he did with almost everything, he said, a little bit of a Mona Lisa smile, he said, "I'm not a surrealist, I'm a fantasist." Which is crazy, of course, because according to his definition, a fantasist should identify himself as a realist, right? He thinks that the zebra walking on the ceiling is perfectly ordinary. But Mark Strand was really one of a kind. Coming back to this question of fantasy versus imagination. In fantasy, the eye of the person fantasizing, the fantasizer is at the center. All things bend to the fantasizer's will and the fantasizer's desire. Fantasy really is a dream in the Freudian sense, in that it is all wish fulfillment. Whereas the imagination, true imagination in this, notional sense, is really much more selfless and has much more to do with an attempt at understanding whether what one is imagining is a real world or not. The unreality of it, if it's there, is not an unreality of self-centeredness. It's not a geocentric but a heliocentric world. Now, part of me wants to say that according to this, praxis poesis theoria distinction, the art that I, value and would hope for more of isn't purely poesis, in that I do want it to produce some effect on the audience, on the reader. So maybe I'm not an Aristotelian in that sense. And so maybe porn and ASMR are really just sort of narrow art. They're just sort of art that's not that great, or art that sort of only does one thing. D.H. Lawrence said that it should be an acceptable goal for art to merely to arouse the reader. I don't know what I think of that, but it's possible that maybe ASMR and porn really are art. They're just sort of art in very peculiar corners of the readerly imagination, or the artistic imagination. But I also think it's possible that really the distinction between art and ASMR, or art and porn, is the distinction between imagination and fantasy. And that's where I think really good comedy bears out that difference. Because really good comedy is humbling, and it's eye-opening. And it, Freud said that laughter is the shock of recognition. It's an involuntary expression of recognition of a buried truth. And so maybe that's the distinction. Now, all of this meditation on categories and the limits of art do bring us to a particular question in this context, which is, well, if ASMR is not art and porn is not art, what are podcasts? And I think they're not really art. Or if they are, they're art only in the sense that porn and ASMR are. And if ASMR is designed to elicit a comforting tingle in the scalp, and if porn is designed to elicit arousal in the genitals, then I think podcasts they might be educational at times. They might be funny, might be entertaining in some ways. But I think they're really a kind of a social prosthetic. I think they are comforting the way that it is comforting to hear your friends talk in a living room when you're maybe half listening, half participating, but it's just nice to know that they're there. And maybe that's part of why podcasting has become even more popular over the course of this fucking pandemic, because your friends, of course, are not there. You are in the living room alone, but for the voice in your ears, that solitude might be a little less tolerable. So, with that, let's start the fucking show. So, my wife gave a lecture today on ghost stories. And talking to her about it ahead of time, an interesting question came up. She had found this list that I think had been made by M.R. James of all of the elements that a ghost story should include. And one of them was, I believe the phrase was, a pleasing sense of terror. And as soon as she listed that, it made me wonder about this particular distinction between terror and horror, because most obviously and immediately, while a pleasing sense of terror makes a kind of an intuitive sense. We can all understand that we've been on roller coasters or been to a certain kind of movie. But a pleasing sense of horror is really just a contradiction in terms. It's not really possible, I don't think, to have a pleasing sense of horror, properly speaking. And so it made me wonder about, what is really the difference, and why should one be more appropriate to ghost stories than the other? And this sent me, as is often the case when I wonder about words, to the dictionary. So I wanted to look at the etymology of both of these words, and of course they're both from Latin. And early on they seem both to be words for a kind of a shaking and fear. But if you go a little further, there's a slight divergence. Terror ultimately comes from tres or tre, for to tremble, to shake, and horror comes from a root that's more like gers or hers, and is related to like the word hirsute. So this is a bristling, and that can be that sort of is used to mean shake in some later on, but at the root, no pun intended, horror seems to be a sort of a bristling response, so that terror is what you feel when you tremble at something, when you shake in the presence of something. Horror is what you feel when your hair stands up on end. And this made intuitive sense to me, because I think, while terror is a more energizing emotion, it's one that activates one, it excites one, it gets one moving. Horror is I think in part always a kind of a sinking feeling. And it occurred to me that these are both Latinate words. If they have Anglo-Saxon equivalents, then I think they would have to be, the terror is to fear, as horror is to dread. And there, the distinction is if anything, even sharper, because if you go deep into the etymology of fear, you get to things like fera for danger, or per for risk, gefahr for peril, attack. Whereas with dread, there's a little bit of a simpler path. Dread appears to come from reden. Reden being an old English word that means advise or prepare, to make ready. And so undreden, or dread rather than just red, would seem to be adread, which is the older form of the word. Dread would actually seem to mean made ready, advised, informed, which is to say, when you are afraid, when you feel fear, then you feel a revulsion or repugnance or a dark sensation towards something that might happen. Whereas when you feel dread, you feel the same thing towards something that having been advised, having been prepared, something that will happen. And there I think terror and horror line up quite nicely. That terror is in some sense a response to uncertainty, whereas horror, I think, is a response to recognition. And that's, I think, really why a ghost story traffics in terror, but not horror, because in some way, on some level, every ghost story is hopeful. A ghost, the proper response, the proper feeling to elicit if you are writing a ghost story is a pleasing sense of terror, a feeling that though one might be afraid of what of what one encounters, there is this possibility, this tantalizing possibility that that things are more than they seem, that something that we don't yet know about might be out there. Whereas horror stories, though they may be populated with monsters and supernatural, presences, ultimately, the horror is the emotion that one feels in recognizing that the world is only exactly what we always feared it was. It is no more. There is really, that's it. I think terror is a deeply unpleasant feeling that is inextricable from hope. And horror is that same feeling with the hope stripped away. And having cheered you up quite effectively, I think let's go ahead and start the fucking show. So last spring, shortly after quarantine started, my older daughter asked if I could teach her how to play checkers. So we made a checkerboard and a set of checkers, and we played together. And eventually she got bored, and she had heard there was a similar game that was a little harder called chess. So she asked about that, and I got us a chess set and refreshed my memory on the rules, and we sort of learned and played together, and we started to get pretty into it. And then I was both intrigued and a little annoyed in October when the Queen's Gambit came out. Intrigued because obviously it's about chess, and annoyed both because it turned out it was not something I could really show my 7-year-old daughter, I guess 6 at the time, and also because at heart I'm a vain and shallow millennial who wants nothing so much as to get credit for having been into something cool before anyone else was. But I watched the series and I enjoyed it, and I followed the media response to it, which was largely glowing. The chess media found it, was almost without exception adoring. The one quibble, which I again take a hipsterish pride in noting that I remarked as well when I was watching it, is that the color commentary recorded about the chess matches in the series seems to have been written and or recorded separately, because a lot of it doesn't actually line up with the matches being played. But that aside, people who are into chess and have been into chess for a long time, much longer obviously than I have, serious chess people did really love it. And I think they loved it for the same reason that I found I did, apart, of course, from Anya Taylor-Joy's just absolute charisma and stylishness. She is terrific, and you should see her in Thoroughbreds as well, as a weird little dark indie movie she's great in, a very different kind of role. There was a lot of criticism of the show. Well, not a lot. There was a non-negligible amount of criticism of the show for what I think are pretty real narrative and structural problems, as well as what really sort of embarrassingly obvious clumsy handling of the one major black character. There's actually a pretty good discussion of this in an episode of Champagne Sharks, which I've recommended before. But I think what I really liked about it, and again, what I think was so easy for chess people to like, apart from the fact that it just got a lot of people into the game, which which is good for chess broadly. What I think I really enjoyed about it is that it was promoted as a serious drama about substance abuse and genius. And there's certainly some genius in it. And there's no doubt there's plenty of substance abuse. I personally find substance abuse narratives to be really boring, partly because there's not really very far they can go. They can either just spiral down into total horror and debasement and oblivion, or they can resolve in a recovery. But otherwise, they're sort of a limited narrative. Reduction is a very serious problem. I just think it makes for boring TV. And there's also just a very obvious reason that there's so much addiction and recovery, and especially 12-step meetings in television movies today. Just, oh god, they never end. There were every series I watch, I feel like there's a at least one, if not half a dozen obligatory scenes in a meeting. And the very obvious and simple reason for this is that every single one of these TV shows, every episode of every TV show, every movie, every screenplay, every one of these things, without exception, in every case, was written by a writer. But what I liked about The Queen's Gambit, to get back to that, what I really liked about it is that it is essentially an action movie. And unlike a lot of other chess movies, say Searching for Bobby Fischer or Pawn Sacrifice, you get to really see the chess games. It's chess is often treated the way big bank heists are in a lot of movies today, where the all of the actual violence is shot in such a choppy, disconnected way that you can't quite track what's happening. And in The Queen's Gambit, at least for much of it, you got to sort of watch move by move a few decent games. Uh, and when I say it's an action movie, I guess what I mean specifically is that it is the 2011 mixed martial arts hit movie Warrior, starring Joel Edgerton and Tom Hardy. In The Queen's Gambit, as in Warrior, an unlikely outsider with a native talent, an abusive parent, and a family history of substance abuse comes from nowhere to compete in a prestigious but niche event that is considered by the outside world, barely to be even a sport. And through a series of grueling trials, demonstrates with a brutal and unpicturesque but fundamentally undeniable technique a dominance in competition after competition, gaining renown as well as the adoration of the crowd until, in a climactic victory, she uses this same proven method to win out over the world favorite to great acclaim. And even more specifically, this technique I'm talking about, because in both MMA and in chess, there is a favored method of victory. For MMA, it's the flashy, swift knockout punch or knockout kick. For chess, it's the elegant, often sacrifice-based forced checkmate combination. You see with Legal, you see with Lasker, you see with Morphy. Most of the really celebrated games the opera game, the immortal game, Legal's Mate. These are these sort of elegant, swift maneuvers that come out of nowhere, and often seem to be suicidal up until the moment in which they're victorious. This is not Beth Harmon's the protagonist of the Queen's Gambit. This is not her method. And this is not the method of the Joel Edgerton character either. In both cases, they proceed by grueling, gradual attrition, just wearing down the enemy until his position and his material are so demoralizing that he gives up of his own will. Now, as I said, in chess, this is not very glamorous, but it is extremely effective. This is, victory by resignation. In mixed martial arts, it's called victory by submission. And while again, the flying kicks and knockout punches and forced checkmate combinations are the more telegenic, I guess. They're the more legendary victories. My brother-in-law, not the ASMR bigot, but a different, better brother-in-law, who recommended Warrior to me. He's into jiu-jitsu, and his argument is that submission is really the nobler form of victory. And I think this holds somewhat in chess. Chess is a little bit of a trickier situation, but I think there is an aesthetically pleasing, at least there's an aesthetically pleasing argument to be made for this, which is that only in submission is there a genuine agreement between the two fighters as to who is the better man, or in Beth Harmon's case, the better woman. There is, there's not a stroke of luck or a bad, neurological lapse. It is brutal, and it is not pretty, but there is a sort of a purity, and there is an inarguable quality to victory by submission. I like that. I like that argument. Not that I do much winning by submission or resignation or anything else in chess. I mostly just continually lose to chess bots designed for children. But the most important thing, and in conclusion, I hope you remember that I was into chess a few months before it became cool. So, on that note, let's start the fucking show. There's a line at the end of Camus' book, The Myth of Sisyphus. It's probably the most famous line in the book, the last line of the main part of the title essay. Camus just described the progress of Sisyphus up the mountain, pushing his giant rock, and then the rock's inevitable tumble back down the mountain to the bottom, from which point Sisyphus will, of course, have to roll it back up again. And when Sisyphus reaches the bottom of the mountain, Camus zooms in on him and makes an observation, concluding his detailed comparison of the mythological figure's punishment to our daily condition here in the real world. He says, this is in the Justin O'Brien translation. I'll read the last paragraph here to lead up to the famous line. I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one burden again. But Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe henceforth without a master seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain in itself forms a world. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. In his short essay on this book, Maurice Blanchot writes, he writes a lot about the argument, but maybe the most devastating summary he offers is simply, happy? That is quickly written. Reminds me of, I was talking to my neighbor Kathleen about Camus the other day, and she quoted The Simpsons saying, Camus can do, but Sartre is smarter. Setting Sartre to one side, I do think that Camus, whom I love, is probably a better artist than a thinker. And it's the facing page. It's a few paragraphs earlier in the essay that I think gives me the most trouble, before he even bothers to say that Sisyphus, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. He says that Sisyphus concludes also that all is well. And the also he's referring to is this earlier quotation. He is referring to Oedipus. He cites Gethsemane, so Christ and Extremis affirms that things are as they should be, that this is what is supposed to happen. We call the day of the crucifixion Good Friday in the Christian tradition, because that's the logic of Christianity. But Camus looks at Oedipus as well. He says, a tremendous remark rings out from Oedipus after he's blind, after he's already learned the full horror of his life, his origin, and his fate, to kill his father and marry his mother. A tremendous remark rings out. Despite so many ordeals, my advanced age and the nobility of my soul make me conclude that all is well. Sophocles' Oedipus, like Dostoevsky's Kirillov, thus gives the recipe for the absurd victory. Ancient wisdom confirms modern heroism. So this is he quotes Oedipus saying, despite so many ordeals, my advanced age and the nobility of my soul make me conclude that all is well. I've spent a lot of time looking for that line. Now, if you go online and you type in Oedipus and all is well, you'll find a whole lot of citations of this quote, and in every case, the phrasing of this quotation that's offered will be Camus, because despite having read Oedipus the King and Oedipus at Colonus a number of times, having taught them even, and then gone back specifically and skimmed the text line by line, more than a couple times, searching for this line, I've not been able to find it, and I have finally tracked down what I think it is, where it comes from. And you'll notice there's a really key difference between what Camus quotes and what Oedipus actually says. So here is the Gilbert Murray translation. Long sufferingness I have learnt by much pain, and the company of the slow years and mine own royalty. So we see there are a lot of the same elements, right? The ordeals, the advanced age, the nobility. But it's not, he doesn't conclude that all is well. He has learned long sufferingness. In the Richard Jebb translation, for patience is the lesson of suffering and of the long years upon me, and lastly of a noble mind. So patience here. In Francis Storr's translation, for I am taught by suffering to endure, and the long years that have grown old with me, and last not least by true nobility. So it's the suffering, by suffering he has learned to endure. And in E.F. Watling's translation, it's little I ask, and I am well content with less. 3 masters, pain, time, and the royalty in the blood, have taught me patience. So in all of these cases, and I'm not a classicist, so maybe some of my Greek literate friends can help me out, but I don't think Oedipus says all is well. This is at the beginning of Oedipus at Colonus, at the end of his life, the end of Sophocles' life. He says that all of these things have taught him patience. They've taught him to endure. They've taught him long-sufferingness. And this is quite different from the conclusion that all is well. Now, I don't think Camus is just using a creative license exactly. I think that he probably believed he was quoting Oedipus. But, if you look at it in his notebooks, he quotes Marcus Aurelius a few times. Wherever it is possible to live, it is possible to live well. Now, Marcus Aurelius died, unlike Oedipus, with his eyes, without having killed his father or married his mother, and while still emperor. He died, an accomplished man in many respects, but not one who had quite gone through what Oedipus had gone through. Now, if you want to hear a man of advanced age and nobility of soul conclude that all is well, read the Meditations, and that's basically the refrain of the book. That despite so many ordeals, all is well. That's something he says in not quite in so many words, over and over and over again. And I suspect that Camus' admiration for Marcus Aurelius caused him to transpose these lines or to combine them in a certain way. Now, it goes further, because there's a moment in Book 11 of the Meditations when Marcus Aurelius actually turns to Oedipus's life. He's talking about tragedies and what one can learn from tragedies, but then he quotes one, and the quote reveals that he's actually specifically talking about Oedipus. He says, and this is in George Long's translation of the Meditations, he says, "For you see that the play must end in such a way, and that even in such cries as, 'O Cithaeron,' there is strength to bear. And the dramatists give us words of help, such as the following: me and my children, if the gods neglect, this has its reasons too." And this is this last quotation is not from Oedipus, but the "O Cithaeron" is something Oedipus cries out when he learns who he is. He learns that he's the son of Laius and Jocasta, and that he was left on Mount Cithaeron and was supposed to be exposed there to the elements to die, but was rescued. And he is crying out to the mountain, Mount Cithaeron, asking why it did not allow him to die there. He should have died there. So though Marcus Aurelius is able to reframe Oedipus' story in terms of his philosophy, that all is finally well no matter what, that's not at all Oedipus' conclusion. And I think my sympathies here are with Oedipus as much as I admire Camus. I think, the myth of Sisyphus, if I'm not mistaken, was written relatively early in his life. I think he was something like 27 when he wrote this. If you read his last novel, The Fall, I think that the image there of these questions is a little more complex. But the specific text this sent me to tonight is a much more recent poem, or much more recent piece of writing. It's a poem by Bill Coyle. This appeared in Poetry magazine in March of 2006. And this is called Kolmarden Zoo. This, I think, makes the distinction quite artfully. So I'll read this. I may say a word or so about it, but then we will move on. This is Kolmarden Zoo by Bill Coyle. Over our heads, trailing a wake of air, and an enormous shadow as it passed, the falcon glided to its trainer's fist and settled like a loaded weapon there. Then, while she fed the bird bit after bit of what? Rabbit? The trainer gave her talk. These birds, she said, prey on the small and weak, adding, for the children's benefit, that this, though it seems cruel, is really good, since otherwise the other rabbits, mice, squirrels, what have you, would run out of space and die of illness or a lack of food. I know what she was trying to get across, and I don't doubt it would be healthier if we were more familiar than we are with how the natural world draws life from loss. And granted, nothing is more natural than death incarnate falling from the sky. And granted, it is better some should die, however agonizingly, than all. Still, to teach children this is how things go is one thing. To insist that it is good is something else. It is to make a god of an unsatisfactory status quo. This vicious circle that the clock hands draw and quarter while the serpent bites its tail or eats the dust or strikes at someone's heel or winds up comprehended by a claw. She launched the bird again. We watched it climb out of the amphitheater, headed toward the darkened spires of a nearby wood, then bank, then angle toward us one last time. It's a sort of a rhetorical poem. It has an argument in it that's, I think, maybe most efficiently articulated in the third to last stanza, the antepenultimate stanza. Still, to teach children this is how things go is one thing. To insist that it is good is something else. The trainer at this zoo argues that the hawk kills weak and vulnerable and young animals, and that's a good thing. The gods sometimes curse a man so that he murders his father and sleeps with his mother, and not only is that the will of the gods in the way of the world, but it's a good thing. The poet or the speaker of the poem, I suspect it's pretty close to Bill Coyle's own perspective, resists this claim. I do think that this is it is a skillful poem throughout. It's just very crisply and tidily put, but it also has, I think, a few sort of moments of rhetorical and artistic flair to it. It's I think a nice revision of the famous Yeats line, "The falcon cannot hear the falconer," from The Second Coming, that in this case the falcon does hear the falconer and returns very neatly and snugly to the trainer's fist. That this is not the world falling apart. This is actually the world exactly as it is supposed to work. And that it's that clockwork regularity, that appropriateness that is itself the source of menace here. And I also, I rather like that he responds to her argument by saying, I know what she was trying to get across, letting us know right away that he's going to object to it, that he's going to present an argument. And then he sets us up to hear his argument. I know what she was trying to get across, and I don't doubt it would be healthier if we were more familiar than we are with how the natural world draws life from loss. And he's given a quatrain there to qualifying his retort, and we're really ready for the but that's about to follow. But rather than letting himself do that, he holds off again, And we hear, oh, and granted, nothing is more natural than death incarnate falling from the sky, which is sort of theatrical, but also, pretty hard to argue with. And granted, it is better some should die, however agonizingly, than all. So he gives us a quatrain of qualification, a to be sure quatrain, but then he finds that he has to continue going so that we get another couple of qualifications, a whole nother quatrain in which he finds his objection shrinking to this sort of small corner, this small principled corner, which is that, all right, yes, you're right. This is exactly the way things are. And maybe it's the way things must be. Maybe in some sense it's the way things should be. But it's still a different thing to say that it is good. It's just a different claim to make. Now, I do think that almost in parallel fashion, if the poem has a weakness, it's in that penultimate stanza. He's stated his case so cleanly and so poignantly. Still, to teach children this is how things go is one thing. To insist that it is good is something else. It is to make a god of an unsatisfactory status quo. And then he performs he spins a couple donuts in the yard. Then he adds a few serifs and curlicues to the calligraphy. This vicious circle that the clock hands draw and quarter while the serpent bites its tail or eats the dust or strikes at someone's heel or winds up comprehended by a claw. This is all very well done. We get the vicious circle along with the clock that becomes the evocation of the drawing and quartering, the ancient medieval torture and punishment, to the Ouroboros, to the serpent in the Garden of Eden, who's cursed to eat the dust and strike at the sons of Adam's heels, and then that I think very nicely drawn last image winds up comprehended by a claw. So the literal meaning of comprehended, to be held with, held within, is also used to suggest that the brutal claw that snatches the snake up from the ground to be dragged to the nest and eaten, that claw in fact doesn't just contain the snake, but in some sense understands it, comprehends it. And all of that is very neat. I think, however, that's a moment where, in an otherwise extremely understated poem, we might just get a little more of the poet's. It might be, we just get a little more of a sense that we're in the hands of a skillful and talented poet who just wants to make sure we don't forget, we don't miss the fact that we are in such skillful and talented hands. I can't really blame Coyle for this, but I do think that it's a moment where we begin to care a little more about the poet than about the poem. But then the last stanza, I think, really clinches it. She launched the bird again, back to that very plain-spoken mode. We watched it climb out of the amphitheater, headed toward the darkened spires of a nearby wood, then bank, then angle toward us one last time. Just that last little echo, that suggestion, that reminder that, once upon a time, and in some sense, always, we are also on the menu. So yeah, I buy Camus' claim that we are Sisyphus. I resist his claim that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. There goes my air conditioning. And I think that is a good place to say, let's start the fucking show.